Yeah, I wasn't sure if he's actually at the not feeling well state or just the like really annoyed state. So anyway,
Either way.
yeah. So anyway, it is great to see you. Um, how long have you been at Valley now?
It's nearly we're at 6 months,
Wow.
so we
Feel,
mid
feel like
July.
you just joined, or feel like you've been there for decades?
It still feels new every day because the life and the systems of an education multi-tiered school is so complex and so varied. I'm constantly the ground is constantly shifting, and I have to figure out what is the schedule, where are people, um, what events are going on that day, that night, this weekend, next weekend, weeks in advance, so that as we plan events, I'm always surprised. Oh, I didn't know that was happening. The master schedule is so full all the time. It doesn't always touch me, but I'm affected by it because the people around me are affected by it. So it, yeah, it's an
And that's
adventure
just
each
the
day.
mechanics of being at
Yeah,
Valley.
that's just the mechanics.
Never mind the politics or the spiritual warfare.
That and so politics, spiritual warfare. This is all part of any organizational behavior when you have a Christian perspective. But there's also this richness of spiritual life that
Mm.
underlies every interaction. It underlies all of the systems. And it is amazing to see God at work through all of these dimensions of what makes a school organization run and function. Um, I am surprised and amazed
Have you ever
every day.
worked in a Christian organization before?
I have never, ever worked for a Christian organization. I forbid my wife from working. So you
Yes,
understand the irony in our relationship, and you know a bit about my wife. She had previously worked for a church at a significant leadership level, and she did that before we were married, and she did it for a short time after we were married. And I heard and learned things about my church that I just wish I didn't know. So
I
so
got my
we
baptism of fire secondhand from
oh
uh, Daniel Ma, the guy who did the Swan Factory with me
yeah
6 years ago, because he left to go work at a church
yes
and then had a fascinating series of adventures there. Uh, and and then of course I did my startup on discipleship in the church, and so
yeah
it's all these things about the, if I can say, the dark underbelly of Christendom that,
um yeah
yeah, that
it's
which is what
go
I
ahead.
want to help you solve for me in the next 40 minutes.
Yeah, it's the humanity, Ernie. It, so you called it the dark underbelly, which is a part of humanity, and so Christian organizations are not excluded from that. They have an opportunity, and I believe we're going to talk about what that opportunity looks like to rise above that and find a different way to communicate heart, mind, and soul, which
Yeah.
is which is different than if we were just a secular organization trying to function.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that we do have, I guess if we have a dark underbelly, we have a silverback. Uh, right?
Interesting. Yeah,
Right?
yeah. There's got to be a flip side, right?
Right. And I think this is the thing, and this is why I'm supposed to talk about Christendom, maybe even more than Christianity,
Yes,
because Christendom is a series of institutions.
yes,
And it's always had this bright halo and this dark underbelly.
yes.
And um, I've been going through many reform attempts over the years that you've been tangentially involved in. And, we had our own with the Great Reset, with the
Yes.
bright halo and the dark underbelly. And the thing that I've really actually learned in the last year is gratitude for both.
Hmm.
In that,
Hmm.
it's like being a dad. Is sometimes you have to do the unhealthy thing in order to keep the family moving forward. Like sometimes you have to yell at your kids and get them out of traffic, even if it creates a scar, even if it makes me feel terrible, because like, if I don't do this, they might die.
Yes.
And I realized, writ large, that is the story of civilization. Our very first podcast where your phone fried. I still tell that story, is that yes, after an hour on the phone with me, he had to literally throw his phone in the freezer before it would recover.
It was hot outside.
It was. It wasn't just me, I'm sure.
And it was hot on my lap. I tell you, it was burning.
But so it's like, okay, like you do have to make the hard choices. You do have to make the ugly compromises to keep things going. But maybe we can do a little bit better.
Yes.
Because maybe there's certain choices we did have to make back in the day to survive. And I've been thinking like a lot of the problem is what I call the Bronze Serpent tragedy. Is that God said, hey, here's this bronze serpent, look at this or you're going to die. And it's like, okay, we got to do it. We don't want to die. You told us to do it.
Yes.
It's good. And it's like, okay, that was God's concession in a moment to keep his people alive, but it was never his perfect plan.
Yes.
And what happens is the people who had the courage and the energy and the devotion to sit there holding up this really awkward, heavy, ugly bronze serpent develop an attachment to that bronze serpent.
Yeah.
And then we start saying, hey, can we just put that down and focus on, the Torah instead? It's like, but my identity is wrapped up in this bronze serpent. If it wasn't, I would not have been able to put in this horribly painful, faithful service over the years. And so I'm trying to have more compassion for myself and others who have their identity attached to the bronze serpent. And I spent a lot of time railing against what's wrong in the world and not always. So I've been moving from railing against what's wrong in the world to trying to rail about what is the right thing we should do, which is a step forward. But then I realized that still leaves people with a sense of shame and no clear way forward. And in some ways sort of can make the chasm worse. One thing my boss has been lecturing me on a lot this year, which I'm slowly learning, is like, Ernie, focus on the small win that preserves the relationship rather than trying to fix the big problem that no one's ready to deal with yet.
Wow.
So it's been hard. It was, I think was it Robbie may have told me, marriages are improved by the 3 or 4 things not said every day.
Ernie, there's like 10 things. But even in the last 4, those are the words from your boss and your recognition and your realization of what the boss was saying with what you understand already is converging. And yeah, the small incremental steps you have are important. I should say, let me complete that sentence. They're important. And I also know that your vision is so far reaching, and your desire to for yourself and to bring others along with you into a more full and complete understanding of who is Jesus Christ and what role does he play in our everyday lives is so powerful for you. You want everybody to get there quick. And yet our own life stories and each person that you speak with is we make these incremental changes over time. So sometimes there's a cataclysmic thing, bang, and suddenly you're transformed in a certain way, but that ongoing growth. And part of my story that I have shared with you frequently is how much the exponential growth that I've had in 5 years versus the last 10 years, though I've been a Christian for over 30 years.
Yeah.
It's almost what has happened recently has been more like a born again experience. Yeah. Like, whoa, there's a whole nother level of Christ.
I think I told you, like every decade, I feel like I'm becoming a Christian again for the first time.
Oh, well, that's great that you recognize it each decade. Yeah. You'll be far ahead of me by the time you get to my age.
Yeah.
And I think it's just terrific. I'm excited about that ongoing growth. God has not given up on me because I've aged. He has not stopped his desire for me to fully understand him because of my age or in spite of my age. And I'm recognizing age has nothing to do with the maturing process.
Yeah,
There's certainly, it plays a role, but it's not determinant.
yeah, I always think of the metaphor of racquetball. I used to play racquetball in college,
Yes.
casually, and you play these old guys, and they would just crush you. Because when you're young, you just run all over the court chasing the ball. But when you're old, you don't have that luxury. You're forced to say, okay, let me just stop and think about where the ball is going to be and be there.
Wow.
And so so I feel like I finally know where the ball is. It's actually right about here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I had kind of an epiphany because I think one of the reasons I get frustrated is I don't know what's real progress or not. And if you don't know what real progress is, then you have to kind of hurry up to get to a conclusion so you have some sense of whether this is even going anywhere. And then I get really frustrated in meetings because I feel like we're just going in this, treadmill where we could waste like 2 hours and never actually make any dent in the real problem. And now I'm, I got many fewer meetings. That's one big blessing from COVID. I only get called to a small number of meetings, half of which I'm running, and the rest of which I can like intentionally decouple so I don't become annoying. But here's the thing that I realized from a church service, and this came through this Zoosophy project I've been working on with Kate and a few other people, which is this idea that moving away from philosophy, the love of wisdom, to what I call zoosophy, living wisdom. Not to be confused with hepatosophy, which is the wisdom of livers, which is actually a thing. That was what the ancient oracles would do. They would, pull up the entrails of the goat.
Yes, and then take a
Interesting, funny word.
Didn't know it had names like that.
So the idea is that, well, what's the difference? And I've been doing a series of dialogues with Socrates, of all people, in addition to my Greek god ones. And one of the things that came out was that a lot of what we consider Christianity is either reprogramming our super ego to be wiser, to have a higher standard of the law, or chiding our ego and id to conform to the superego. And those are both very useful civilizing things. But they are precisely the law and the prophets, right? The law is the superego, what you should be. And the prophets are, you know what the truth is, you better do it. And it's like, okay, the law and the prophets are essential. We would not be here without them. What they have done will never be taken away from them. But that is not the gospel. And what I realized, there's this weird mental blindness where I think we have been trained to ignore that distinction. We literally cannot see it. It's like the distinction between the letters R and L in Japanese. It is like, it just doesn't exist in our vocabulary. And so when people come to me and they're hurting, my instinct is to reach for the law or the prophet. And I think I'm being Christ-like because I'm doing it out of compassion and care and love. And it's like, oops. And it's like, so this is the thing, is that, the law tends to be up here, especially in the West, very cognitive, intellectual knowledge of this is what you ought to do. I call it responsible David when I'm talking with my friend David Huffman. It's like the part of you that gets you up in the morning, makes you go to work and do what you're supposed to do. Okay, and we need that. And then there's the prophets, which is the exhortation, which I think of as really more the I don't know where I guess acetylcholine is what they call willpower. There's some brain thing that lets you make decisions, right? And it's like force of will. But there was a wonderful essay I heard about yoga, and it says if you have a 40-year-old woman who's been doing yoga every day next to a 20-year-old football player, that football player is really strong and has willpower and can bend himself into that shape through sheer brute effort. Whereas the woman who's been doing yoga is supple and she can relax into that pose without needing nearly as much strength or willpower. And I realized the way that I grew up and understand Christianity is it was focused on appropriate outcomes, but it was blind to the distinction between strength and will versus flexibility and suppleness.
Nice illustration.
And so this is what I think, and this thing about, this verse I keep coming back to. What does it mean to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus? The short answer is that it is reprogramming the amygdala, the part in our brain that stores traumas and identity.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is where I least act like the person I want to be. and that's like, so things that touch the amygdala count as spiritual growth, and everything else counts as religion. That's kind of my rubric that I use. And it's actually useful because it actually is more grace. Because I hear a sermon say, okay, 95% of that was religion and culture just to build a rapport with the audience. And there's one little drop of actual spiritual growth in there. And if people got that, then that was a worthwhile thing. I would not want to sit through all 4 hours of it, but I can appreciate that, like, okay, that's the thing that person has been called to by God that still is making something worthwhile. And learning to find those little crystals and gems in there and realizing that, like, we have to embed it in some cultural matrix for people to be able to see it or hear it.
Yes.
That was actually how Ted and I started the Great Reset. It seems like that, like 80% of sermons were like cultural, like, hey, we're part of your tribe, and maybe 20% of it was actually useful. And it's like, but that's actually what you need when you're dealing with people cold. So it's like, okay, long story. It's like, okay, so the goal is to reprogram the amygdala. And the way to do that, the sustainable thing that does that is culture. Culture is how we programmed our amygdala in the first place with language and rituals and experiences and relationships. So if the goal is to reprogram the amygdala, that is equivalent to co-creating, one of our favorite words, co-creating a new culture. And it's like, okay, that is a well-defined problem statement. And the way that we do that, and this is the other little epiphany I had, is with my son's dog, this chocolate lab.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my dog is a very traditional dog. He is exceptionally doggy in that he is incredibly loyal and incredibly food motivated, right? And so he will like go through an agility course like this, if you're leading him with the food. My son's dog does not care about food. And he's not deeply attached to any one individual. Like he will like meet someone and be like their best friend in 10 seconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he is just like all over the place. He's a puppy. But he is deeply attached to my dog. So I was trying to teach this dog to fetch, because he will love like chasing a ball and grabbing it, but bringing it back and letting go of it is quite hard. That's an unnatural movement, right? I guess that's more of a parenting movement than a puppy movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but what happened was, so the way I trained him was, I would throw the ball, the dog would chase it, Frolic would chase it, and then I would call Quinn to me. And Quinn, being loyal and food motivated, is like, maybe he's got food, and he'll do this 10 or 20 times with no food, just on the off chance. And then when Quinn comes to me and I go, Quinn, good boy, Frolic would come to me to be with Quinn. And then he would get so excited, he would drop it and say, fetch, 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 good boy, Frolic. Like he did the action, and then I attached a word to it in this positive emotional experience. It's like, that's how you teach language to dogs. And that's how we teach language to our children. And that's how we create a new culture. We have an intense emotional
Yes.
experience
Yes.
that people want to be a part of. You get them to do the thing, and then you attach a word to it.
Yes.
And like, if we just do that, and then we just create more and more communities and networks of people doing this, then you have a new culture, then you have the kingdom of God advance.
Yes.
So that's the concept. Now the content is fascinating. I have this new best friend, a guy named Joel McGill. He was raised Baptist and he works for YWAM. And he has a lot of cognitive dissonance because of that, right? Because they're all like Holy Spirit, go with the flow. And he's like, I like plans, I like theology, you know? And so every time God speaks to him, he's always a little ambivalent about it. It's like, and so, but he had this really clear word from God. And he's actually running this organization called All America. They're trying to apply basically missions thinking to the United States.
Great.
And they do three things. I think I introduced you to them, right? I guess maybe I was waiting for this phone call. So he wants to meet Valley because they're moving into California. They've got a little pilot project going, and that's why I reached out to you because I said I should talk to you first and explain what's going on. So okay.
Oh yeah.
I'll do this. So they do three things. One is that they have this set of metrics for what it means to be evangelized or gospelized. And it's, basic things like, that they're engaging with scripture, they're engaging with the community, they're practicing mercy and justice, very, reasonable things, but they have it like really rigorously defined and they have this whole network. And the idea is that like, hey, all we want to do is to say, like, this is what it means to evangelize America. And if we focus on these metrics and just report them up, then we're all pulling together on the same team and we can strategize and figure out how to work together more effectively. And they're doing it as a really lightweight thing. It's like, you don't have to use our branding, you don't have to use any of our tools. We just want to know that you're doing this and let us know so we can track it. And then we can figure out where we are doing this and where we're coaching people to do this better and where we need to put more effort in. It's like, and so that's like the top level. It's like, okay, that's nice. I've seen things like this before. It's, a little bit better organized, 21st century, but it's still like every decade or so, some Christian organizations doing this. The second thing that's interesting is they're actually working hard on the infrastructure for how to share data and coordinate activity. So they're trying to build a missional community, a social network, an app, dashboards. He's meeting with data scientists and our friends at Faith Tech and all these things. So and they're like also what in technical terms, they're modularizing Christian resources. Say, okay, these are the 5 metrics. Like, here's a class that will help you. This is a Bible study you can use as a type of Bible engagement based on our friends' Discovery Bible Study, right? And so they're like sort of modular, and like when they go into a community, they say, okay, let's get all the pastors who care about the Great Commission, which is mostly evangelicals and charismatics, but some of the mainstream groups too. And there's a parallel movement happening in the Catholic space as well that they're trying to connect to. And then they say, okay, let's figure out what we are all doing and like bucket this together and where we can cooperate, where there's holes to fill. And they're sort of rationalizing supply. That is the term in industry. Right, it's when you go from like a bunch of random drivers holding up white cards to Uber. Right, you're rationalizing the supply, which makes it easier to vastly increase consumption.
Yes,
because otherwise you optimize for what the producers are comfortable doing, which isn't necessarily what the consumers need.
Yes.
Right. Okay. We could go a lot of places there, but we'll just leave that for now. The really interesting thing, and the reason why I love Joel, is that I think all of that is just kind of window dressing, even though that's what they spend all their time talking about. The really interesting thing going is that they use this as a crucible to bring people together to practice spiritual unity. And so just bringing the Baptists and the Assemblies of God in one group to say like, hey, we have our differences, but what matters most is we want to evangelize this region with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to let go of this. I'm going to say, this man is my brother, and we are going to focus on the work rather than on what makes us distinctive.
Yes.
And so this was the first thing that like okay, and I said like, this is the real thing, right? This is the gem. Everything else is almost just sort of an excuse to have that spiritual transformation take place. But it's good, it's important, it's necessary, right? It's good context. But then the real thing is, he had this big meeting in Kansas City, which was, I guess, one of the things that was going on in Kansas.
Hmm.
There was all this stuff happening last year around the 100th anniversary of the Azusa Street Revival in the last year or two. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Pentecostal movement.
No.
You've heard of
Uh,
Pentecostals.
Say that again.
You've heard of Pentecostals.
Yes.
Okay, so the Pentecost movement, as we know it, started about 100 years ago in a thing called the Azusa Street Revival.
Aha.
What I didn't know was that that was actually an offshoot of the Wesleyan revivals, or actually no, of the Welsh revivals, which I think was tied to, I forget exactly, but there was a revival in England,
Yes.
and in the 19th century, we did not actually have a 20th century revival. That was the first century in like 500 or 600 years that we didn't have a revival in England. Interesting. I don't know what that means, but hopefully we got a double portion coming this century. The Welsh Revival first landed in Kansas. And there's a place, I forget the name of it, but there's a small town in Kansas, which was like the epicenter of this, which then led to the people who went over to Azusa Street and started that whole thing, which gave birth to the Assemblies of God and the Foursquare and the Church of God and the Charismatic Movement and pretty much all the sort of innovation, the spiritual theological innovation of the last century has been coming out of the Charismatic Movement in a lot of ways. Not all of it good, but all of it interesting. And what was fascinating is they were at this place there as one of these events was happening. And God like took him out into a cornfield, and this poor Baptist guy gets dragged out by God to a cornfield, and God says to him, this next revival will be about the fruit of the Spirit rather than the gift of the Spirit or the gifts of the Spirit. And like that is an amazing lens for looking at it, because you say, when you don't have the fruit of the Spirit, you need professionals who will keep the machine running. And they will rely on their gifts, whether that's spiritual gifts or intellectual gifts or personal charisma or whatever. And it's like, okay, we needed that to survive. We needed that to function, to hold the organization together. People who are willing to sacrifice themselves on the professional altar to keep this thing going so that, civilization persists, right? A church in a frontier town brought civilization, made the women feel safe, educated the kids.
Yes.
And created that anchor. And it had to exist, whether or not it was always the most godly thing, whether it was always, doing the right thing, just existing. It was salt and light. It was, at least it was salt. Maybe I don't know if it was salt and light, right? It kept the meat from going to rot, and it kept a picture of what life could be. And that was the bronze serpent God gave us for the last 2,000 years of Christianity, was perfect. Or 1700, if you want to say it started only after Constantine. Although it really was starting to happen, I think. The thing about bishops, I don't know if you know one of random things, is that bishops, the reason we call priests is really bizarre, is that originally everyone just had these love feasts in their homes, but it started getting out of control as people were just getting drunk and whatever. And so the overseer said, hey, let me just oversee this thing and make sure everyone's behaving themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow, I don't know why, Janet has a friend I need to grill on this who studies first century Christianity. The bishop became the only person who would do the ritual sacrifice. And then they devolved it out to the presbyters, the preachers in the local gatherings, and they became known as priests. And so there's this weird centralization and decentralization that led to this word priest becoming the bedrock of Christianity for, 1,500 years. And I don't know why that happened, but clearly it had to happen, and it was profoundly adaptive, or wouldn't have survived for 1,500 years. So that happened even before Constantine. All this stuff happens. Okay, so there's something there about the professionalization of the role of someone being the father figure to keep things running that was essential, because that's the only form of Christianity that survived. I'm sure there were other versions that were more emergent and more ad hoc and more organic, and they just died. So it's like, okay, we can't get rid of all that. But the thing that would make a difference is precisely the fruit of the Spirit. Because against such things, there is no law, right? And for me, right, like if I'm talking about truth and reform and fixing things, there's a law against that for good reason. I think about this a lot. Is like, okay, all these questions I'm asking, they have the potential to destabilize and destroy society. There's a reason why people react to me the way that they often do, is because we have been conditioned, like, don't ask those questions. You could destroy everything. And it's like, that's true. In my defense, a lot of it's falling apart anyway. And I had to go through this whole narrative arc. But it's like, okay, so now having gone through all this, now it's like, okay, all this stuff that I've gone through, all the angst, all the frustration, all from, it's like, okay, none of that matters anymore. It's how I got here. But I need to let go of all that and say, okay, what we're going to do is just create these wonderful experiences of encountering Jesus that reprogram your amygdala, and we'll give some words for it, and we'll give you a community you can practice those words. And that's it. You don't have to give up anything. You don't have to critique anything. You just show up and do it. And the thing that really crystallized this for me was the Minerva Project, where they said, the problem with education is you learn things in one context and you're left on your own to figure out how to apply it in another context. So we're going to create these hashtags to give you little hooks to hang these ideas on there. And then our whole active learning process is about learning to practice using these hashtags in the active learning part is using them sort of in real time and sort of contrived situations. And then the rest of your education is learning how to do this in the real world, going out into the cities, different countries, and actually building real world projects for real world clients. But then you use all these hashtags to say, oh, we're using this skill here, using this skill there. And at the end, you're not measured in how well you repeated back the content in the first lesson. Yes. It's how well you've mastered it by the end, right? All right, so that's a really long background. I asked for 45 minutes. Do you have a hard stop? Can I keep going?
Let's keep going.
All right, so I can actually now go to the slides. So this is, I don't know if you glanced at this or not, but this is
I did. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for looking ahead. So yeah, and the first thing was like, okay, fruit of the spirit. And then the second half of it was, okay, the problem is that, do I actually have this here? I don't have this here. I have an emotion chart. And I realized, like, there's a lot of fruits that are also emotions, right? The emotion of joy, the emotion of peace, the emotion of love.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, that's a problem in that we don't clearly distinguish between our natural human emotion and the actual fruit of the spirit. And someone who, like, out of personality or force of will demonstrates that emotion, we think they're spiritually mature. But that's not actually the way it works. It doesn't help us grow in the fruit of the spirit. And so to me, the issue is precisely the cross, the denying the self, reprogramming the amygdala. And so that's the whole premise of this, is that we want to have these fruits not just by cultivating human emotion, by actually going to the cross. And so, oh yeah, that was my second point there. So these were so there's 9 fruits of the spirit. And what I'm starting with is like, okay, what are the human emotions that I experience that trigger my amygdala so I fail to demonstrate the fruit of the spirit? And then how do I read an essay once, which was to just say, like, okay, the best way to actually train yourself to handle anger is put yourself in situations where you remember being angry and then learn how to process it. Mm-hmm. And I suggested doing that with some friends. It's like, that sounds like the worst possible thing you could do is get a bunch of people together and make them angry. It's like, well, that's kind of what I've been doing accidentally all along. Isn't it better if I do it intentionally? But the idea is that, okay, this is the refined version of that, is we study a passage where those emotions are in play. And then we wait for the spirit to see which emotions and reactions they bring up. And some people will have a lot, some people have a little, but we all learn from each other. And then we can say, that is the word we need. And that's how we learn. Right, and so the first, and so there's 9 of these things. I felt like it should be 12 weeks. And so there's like 2 intros, 9 fruits, and a conclusion. The first one is one of our favorite phrases. Oh, there it is, the definition. Living scripture is the hashtag. and the idea of Matthew 7, Sermon on the Mount. I'll just go through these here, and then if you want to, we can dive into more of them. The second is this idea of logos formation, which I love the word logos because it has the idea of logic, it has the idea of Christ, but it's really just a word. And how do you form a word? And this is the skill that, actually it's funny. We do this a lot in the modern world, but we don't think of it. We used to think of it like an acronym or a curriculum or a rubric, but really it's all forming words or concepts and labels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Concepts and labels, right?
And then this idea, I've been thinking about this, the thing that I want to change is our logos, our wiring, our operating system.
Yeah.
Right. And then the first thing and this is a thing that God's been pounding on me the last couple of weeks, as this is the one thing that if I could do this with other people would radically transform them and our relationships. And the reason I don't is because at some level, I'm not as strong in it as I need to be. Mm. And this is the idea of totally, and I love the phrase radical acceptance. I started with radical forgiveness, but the more I talked about it, it really just came out as radical acceptance. And it's not superficial acceptance, like just tolerating you saying you're okay. It's like, no, deep down, I know who you are and I accept you as that, especially the parts you don't accept about yourself.
Yes.
That is the thing that Christ does.
Yes.
Maybe that is Christing, I don't know. And the thing that keeps us from doing that, we were doing this emotional study and I was talking with Robbie about this, I have no concept of the emotion disgust. I don't recall feeling it. I don't think about it. It seems to have no relevance to me. And then Robbie said, well, Ernie, you would talk about how I would do something and it would trigger this allergic reaction in you. Mm-hmm. I think that's disgust. Mm-hmm. And this is one of my premises, is that it is the emotions we do not feel that control us the most. Because whenever we get a micro dose of that emotion, we run full speed in the opposite direction so we don't have to feel it. Mm. And my some of these things like sit there and pound my brain with repeated devotionals to get something that I glimpse for a moment and then my brain just runs away from it. Wait, are you saying I'm responsible for this really dysfunctional relationship I'm in, that I can't just blame that entire other person for everything? I'd rather not think about that. And I don't. And so it takes this discipline, this practice community to get to it. Anyway, so radical acceptance. The next one, which I think comes in really well here, is this idea of fruitful suffering, which is deeply in the Beatitudes. My friend Daniel and I, when we were doing our devotions online for the Swan Factory, I guess I started this whole performative lifestyle when I was doing that startup. We did a sermon, a devotional on Hebrews 12, and it just finally struck me that everything that I had held as resentment towards God as Father was actually evidence of how deeply he loved me. Mm. And it was a transformational moment. And I have never been able to figure out how to explain that to someone. And the answer is you can't actually explain it. But maybe we can find some ways. And that's what I realized about the training and education. Okay, I can't get people to do this. The Spirit of God has to do this. Yes. But I can show them what this is and put a word on it so they learn to recognize it and learn to value it. Right? This is the idea of a curriculum. The whole point of this is these are the things that if we at least understand that this is the most important thing, and we build a community that celebrates this, then we can get better at it.
Yes.
Right? And even if people even just call me out for my hypocrisy for not doing it, there was this guy I met online on the Wisdom app who just said, Ernie, you're just rude. And I go, oh my gosh, you're right. And the reason I was rude is I was brought up in the tradition of Socrates. Socrates was the voice in my head saying, well, why do they do that? Do you actually know what you're talking about? Let me grill you and find out if there's something real there. Mm. And I
mm,
realized like that was
mm,
a good thing, but that was not a Christ thing.
mm.
Christ did something similar to that, but not quite
Yep.
the same.
Yeah, he had a different goal in mind.
Yeah. And also his goal was to get killed. That was part of the reason Jesus alienated the Pharisees. And I keep reminding
Yeah.
myself, if I don't want people to kill me, I should not imitate that aspect of Christ. Because that was part of the role he was playing as Messiah.
Yeah.
And there's a different role we get to play now. And so anyway, so I had to go through the whole exorcism of rewriting that voice in my head. But also what's funny was I thought I was going to throw that head under the bus. But in fact, what Socrates did with the voice in his head, his daimonia, he said, and this, like, I write these stories and these characters surprise me. He said, I know that voice was always there to help me. So if it failed me, it's because it itself is in need of rescuing. And I should have pity on it rather than feeling betrayed by it. And that was such a weird thing, which totally like convicted me, right? Because I've always felt offended when other people claim to know the truth and try to tell me I'm wrong and I should embrace their truth. And I feel like I therefore have the right to expose them as shallow and hollow and superficial. And realizing that that was actually a sense of offense and resentment or even entitlement that I was responding to ungraciously with. So anyway, like I said, and that was just a long way of saying, like, this guy calling me out for being rude triggered an incredibly deep sense of reflection and recovery. And it's like, even if this is the standard of hypocrisy against which I want to be judged, like my worst enemies can play this game, right? And they help me. So that's Fruitful Suffering. The next one piece, and this is from a guy named Daryl Davis, who's this Black man. I don't know if you've heard about him. He'd be a great speaker to bring to Valley. He sort of accidentally ended up talking hundreds of people into leaving the Ku Klux Klan. And he did this because he was doing a jazz set at a bar in the South, which was a white-only bar, but they brought him in. And he's this Black guy. And this guy just started talking to him and like wanted to buy him a drink. And then turns out this guy was a Klansman. He's kind of embarrassed, but he's like a big fan of jazz. And like, and Daryl Davis was confused. And he was curious. He says, why does this guy hate me when he doesn't even know me? And it's like, how did he pull that off? Well, I discovered when he talks about his backstory, like he can't explain why. He just does it. He's not particularly religious or philosophical. He just does this. But he talks to these people. He expresses, he like corrects them where he thinks they're factually wrong, but he just accepts them and listens to them. And after a while, they just say, you know, and this totally floored him when it first happened. He's like, I've quit the Klan. I've decided I don't believe that anymore. And like, he wasn't even trying to do that. He was just trying to understand for his own sake.
Yeah.
But the reason I think he was able to do this is he grew up in the Foreign Service. His parents were activists in the 60s, got sent overseas. And so I realized he grew up, he was American. He was the exemplary American to all these foreigners that he hung out with. And so the idea that this thing, well, you're not a real American or you're not worthy, like, it wasn't, there was no grain of truth in there to trigger him. It was just like, that's just ridiculous. That's just silly. It wasn't offensive or shameful or hurtful because his identity was rock solidly secured somewhere else.
Yes.
I've noticed that with my kids, right? If my kids are acting out in a way that I'm emotionally secure in, I can be really gracious. If they trigger something at some point with me or with my wife or with my parents, I am not the perfect loving father I'd like to think I am. And so that was
there.
External identity, which somewhere Matthew 6 about not worrying is tied up in that. It's funny. So the list of this, I took I think it's the NIV list of NCV list of the 9 fruits. And this is Plutchik's Wheels of Emotions. Like, there's different ways of doing it, but I figured let's just pick a common source and just go with it and see if we can make it fit.
Yeah, it's a great reference.
I'm working on a properly computational scientific theory of emotion, but that'll probably take a few more months. the and it's funny, one of the emotions is anticipation.
Yeah,
Um,
it's an interesting one. I had to redefine anticipation when I read this in your curriculum.
yeah. But I realize, like I anticipate the kingdom of God. I'm longing for the kingdom of God. And that makes
Exactly.
me impatient and act out in ways that make it take longer for the kingdom of God to show up. But this is the thing at work. I had this beautiful picture of how we could function, and that is actually a curse and a trade-off. And it makes me realize, oh yeah, it is actually adaptive for people to deny these truths so that they don't become such impatient jerks that make things harder for everybody else. And it's like, so realizing that this is an emotion, not a virtue, realizing that it's got an upside and a downside. And for me, and I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out, but the thing that always struck me was Jesus. And this is the very beginning of the story where he says, oh, gee, Lazarus is about to die. It's a good thing I'm here and can't go help him. So let's wait a few days. Which is like the one verse that my charismatic friends, it blows their minds because they are focused on the truth that God wants to heal us and God wants to destroy every sickness and sin. And they are absolutely right that God wants to do that.
Yes.
But he doesn't want to do it right now and right away.
Or in the way that we think,
right,
or the way that we want God to do
right.
it. He has a plan bigger.
Right, but like I was talking to our friend Ross Lambert, who may not have been in the first series, and he says, he's very Baptist, and like he doesn't want to think about the fact that God could cure every disease and sin because that would blow his mind. And it's like, okay, we have to make different trade-offs because if we try to encompass every truth, we would literally go insane and not be able to function. We have to make different trade-offs, and God allows all of us to make different trade-offs to really focus in on one deep truth that God has, even if that distorts our vision of everything else. And I can see how other people's truth distorts their vision, but it's a lot harder for me to see where that's happening to me.
Good point.
Right. So anyway, anticipation there is.
It may also be that the way that you describe focusing on a particular truth in the present time, it's because our brains and our selves are limited in our ability to manage all the truths at one time. So let's take them as they come, or take them as we find them in our own process of growth, and work through that, then move on to the next one. I don't know that we could write that out as a curriculum, but it would help us in our limited capacities to cope with that much information, both emotional, social, and spiritual, to be able to function by saying, okay, this is the one that's working out right now, or here are the 2 or 3, but I certainly can't master all 24 or 150, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, let's go with 9.
Much simpler.
Right. Yeah. If we figure there's 8 basic emotions, these, and at least the claim is that these are like preserved throughout all organisms.
Yeah, I like that framework.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Good one to use.
And the idea is that, and caveat one is that, like, okay, for me, these emotion and fruit pairs work well, but the mapping is probably not unique, right? There are probably other people where different emotion gets in the way of a fruit, or there's different ways of interpreting, and that's fine. It's like, I got to start somewhere, and this is a useful thing, and it's all open source, people can riff on it. And I feel like in any given group, there'll be like a couple people who would really resonate strongly with, a couple of people it sort of works with, and a couple of people it's like, it didn't work for me, but I can see that it works for you. And that's fine.
Yes.
Whether that means that they're hard of heart, or whether it's really just totally the wrong thing, doesn't matter. And it's actually good that you have this gradation of responses, right? Yes. It's not about getting it right. It's about just seeing it in other people. And you could be someone who, like, I didn't feel anything at all, but I saw this in you, and that really stuck in my head.
Yes.
Like, that counts.
Yes,
right?
It does.
And we all help each other on that food. So it's not perfect, but it's anti-fragile. It gets better the more it breaks. Anger was a fun one, but at least for me, anger tends to be the opposite of gentleness. And this is one of my favorite verses that I want to do a DBJ on, which is Peter Peter slicing off Malchus's ear and Jesus healing it. And the reason I love that is because I realize when I am defending Jesus, I often destroy other people's ability to hear.
Oh, beautiful.
Right? Like this is
That, dude,
biblical unity in a nutshell, right?
that was a great sermonette right there in 2 sentences. That's powerful.
Yeah, there might be a better hashtag for that. But actually, maybe the reason I went with that though is this is a thing. There's this essay I'm working on. I don't know if I'll finish it, but I discovered when I was talking to somebody about grace, and I realized they were assuming I meant grace for someone, meaning like, okay, I'm not going to get offended at them. I will let them be. I have grace for him.
Yeah.
And that is an important part of grace.
Yes.
But that is not the fullness of grace. Right? And the verse I keep coming back to was where Paul says, and God's grace to me was not without effect, because I worked harder than any of them, but not me, but grace working in me.
Okay.
Right? There's a empowering grace that does things. And I'm actually convinced that the reason I try to help people and fail is because I'm trying to get them to get rid of their baggage so I don't have to get rid of mine.
Wow, that's a huge revelation. That's the equivalent of the log of trying to remove the log out of a brother's eye.
Like this is like the log in the speck. Everyone knows the log in the speck, right? Yeah. It's such a beautiful metaphor. But like, oh, this is what it means, is that if I'm offended at someone, this is a sign where I lack grace in myself for myself. And I need to go back to the well and experience deeper grace. And then I will have, I mean, like the reader, Peter chopped off Malchus's ear is because he was terrified of denying Jesus, right? Sure. He had failed to deal with and like Peter, like Socrates, God told him there's nobody wiser than you. But Socrates kept going out trying to prove the God wrong and got killed for his troubles. And I just asked the question in my little essay, like, what if God should have said, by the way, Socrates, you know, I was right, and you were wasting all your time annoying these people trying to prove me wrong. If you just accepted it, like, you wouldn't be dying now, and they would be in a much better place. And so Socrates has to grapple with that, just like Peter here. He doesn't want to just accept what Jesus said is true, and so he fights it and ends up causing all these problems and cutting off our ears. And so the idea is that if I can have grace for myself, I can, one, I'll be at peace, even if they don't change. Two, I will respond graciously to them so that our relationship will be preserved or enhanced rather than distanced. Three, I will treat them better, which will create a space where they can be drawn into responding in healthier ways because I'm breaking that programming. And fourth, I think that spiritually, if I have grace in an area, I have authority to pray over it in a way that if I don't, I haven't. And I've discovered this. If like I pray in an area when I have grace and anointing and authority, I see things change. And if I pray for something I'm weak in, I get massive blowback. Like I've discovered this. If I pray for an area in somebody's life that I haven't dealt with, I will start having all these temptations and struggles in my life.
Yeah.
And like, oh, well, one is like, okay, like my charismatic, oh yeah, it's a sign that you're getting onto Satan's turf, so he's fighting back. That's true. So it's a sign that there's something important going on there. But it's also a sign that I need to deepen myself spiritually. And that's the sort of comprehensive grace that, and like, this is something I think that I can actually explain. I just gonna take me a long time, so I haven't finished it yet. So I got an essay on that coming out sometime, God willing, 2022.
That's a big issue to wrestle. That's a big one.
Yeah, I'm enlisting my cousin-in-law who used to run a seminary, so he can help me thrash it out. So like these first ones are all like stabbing me in the heart. The rest are like, okay, these are cool. These aren't quite as much the emotions that are harder for me.
You mean surprise and joy?
Yeah, or trust even. I mean, these aren't the ones that are as visceral for me. Trust and like fear. Fear is one that is not that visceral for me. But so it works out well that the ordering which I think comes from there, tends to track the ones that are most. Now, it could be, of course, like a lot of sometimes I'll do these things and it's like, oh, it's not a big deal for me, but I'll still get walloped over the head by it when I actually.
Right.
So at least, but at a superficial level, just talking about it isn't quite as mean. But I think they're all there, right? And one nice thing about this helped me define the difference between gentleness and kindness.
Yes.
Because they always blur together in my head. And this is the only definition, but it's a useful definition, right? So anyway, trust, and this is I guess a silly one, but it's a big deal. Like a lot of times people, maybe I may even actually change this because is wise risk.
Oh, good change.
Yeah, right. And this is in my 6-syllable gospel. I did a series of words for my daughter. I wrote a little booklet out of it, where the gospel is God loves us like Jesus, which is my 6-syllable way of summarizing the gospel. And I go down 5, 4, 3, 2. And faith is 2 syllables, which is wise risk.
Nice.
And the rich young ruler and the whole idea of the impossible and the eye of the needle is that it's really what we're willing to sacrifice and surrender. But I actually like the word risk rather than sacrifice, because sometimes you have to offer it up and history doesn't.
Yes.
And that's the risk. And that's entrepreneurship.
Right? Very much so, right?
Yeah. Again, this one I'm looking for a better phrase if we get one. So the idea of this is this is the idea of where fear is a good thing. Fear teaches you what you value. Right? If I'm afraid, because we have a lot of your health, your safety, your cultural identity,
yes,
your people, and what you love, right? Like being a parent, you fear for a whole bunch of things you never feared before, right?
It's information. I believe.
Yeah. And it's information about what we are afraid of losing.
Yes, correct.
And that is precisely the thing that we need to entrust Jesus with.
Correct.
And so this is the clunkiest phrase here. Maybe you can help me with it a bit here, is wordsmithing it.
Changing loss identifying to something else?
Yeah, because the idea, let me just try it, is this idea of for most part, like it's focusing on the positive thing that we want to do. Right? Weight training is a little bit negative, but it's such a cute pun, I have to keep it in there. The thing that we do when we lose our life.
You're trading fear for faith.
Yeah.
Something along it's along the lines of what you give up to get what you need. To move past fear, yes. You're going to lose something in order to win.
To win. There's 3 words, but they're short. Yeah, and that is the cross right there, right? Lose to win.
It reminds me of the realization that before being a Christian, before choosing Christ, I believed I was living a life that I wanted to live. And becoming a Christian was this transition in realizing I was losing the life that I really didn't want to have anyway, and gaining a life that I didn't have any recognition of the fulfillment of my life. I didn't see it that way. I thought I was giving up. I didn't know that I was gaining. So that transition of giving up a life that I really didn't want to have anyway was a foreign idea. I couldn't grasp it at first. It took time. it took time for me to see the goodness of faith in Christ.
Yeah. Oh, I have to tell you, so when I was having I had a couple of rough stretches, let's call it.
Yeah.
And one of them, I was going down the rabbit hole of watching YouTube music videos, and some of which were not necessarily very edifying. But one of them was I took a pill in Ibiza or something like that, which was this really weird thing. But what I loved about it, there's a Panic at the Disco song, "Hey Look What I Made It," which is a very similar theme. This guy takes this pill. He's this guy staggers into a bar and takes this pill, and then his head gets replaced by this fake paper mache head. And then he goes through and has all these weird, wild, corrupt experiences. And I realized, oh, and like it's a fixed expression on this paper mache head.
Oh, right.
Right. Yes. So he's just like having these things, and it's almost like they're not affecting him. And I realized, oh, yeah, that's why I want to be happy in my flesh, because I feel like it's joy, right? Joy is also an addiction, right? It's not a virtue. It is an emotion. Mm-hmm. And we have a culture that's addicted to joy in a lot of ways, literally, in the case of pills.
Yeah.
But lots of other ways too. And I realized one of the insights of philosophy is joy is kind of disconnecting from self. And I realized, oh yeah, when I indulge like this, I am being happy at the price of not being myself. I'm making the shadow meat puppet of myself happy. Mm-hmm. And it feels good. Mm-hmm. But there's this deep inauthenticity, to use the trendy word, in that happiness. And that was actually enough to break me out of that thing. It's like, okay, like, yes, I'm not happy. And like, I want to feel good. But the price of that is I'm losing myself.
Yes, it could be. Addiction goes along that path.
Right. And even if it's not addiction in the clinical sense, it is distraction. Like a lot of our religion and worship, a lot of our academic achievement.
Ernie, what did you just step into right now?
I'm already in the middle of it. But yeah, this is losing to win. So I think this is the thing, right? Because we all want to win, and realizing this is the Christing move of like, yes, the thing that you care most about is precisely when you surrender that you will get everything that you want.
Yeah, crazy notion, right? And that's how God turns our human perspectives around to see the world from his perspective.
Yeah. By the way, what I'm planning to do is to chop this up into the little like 3-minute video slices for each one. And I was going to use that in the course. So the idea is this course. Right. And
yes,
people don't have to do it, but if they want to do more than just the one sentence thing that they read, they can watch this little snippet where we discuss it and see some of the backstory and think about if they want to do it differently, whatever, and then especially for the director's cut, for people who want to create their own version, want to translate in other languages, who want to do with a different set of emotions, like, hey, go for it, right? This is all there. All right.
I like that idea. That's
now,
great.
Here's this word. Surprise was surprising when I discovered that was considered an emotion. But the really shocking thing I discovered is that's actually the primary emotion that bifurcates into fear and anger. Well, I always thought like fear and anger were opposites, like joy and sadness were opposite, but apparently in the biochemical analysis of this, there's this, or in the brain science, there's this thing called surprise. And if you're on the feeling good about yourself side, it becomes anger. If you're feeling bad about yourself, it becomes fear. And so they're like right next to each other, next to surprise. But what's fascinating is that surprise almost comes before these other things. Like first it's like, something's happening. Is it good or bad? Is it, how do I respond to it? So there's like 2 or 3 layers between surprise and fear and anger.
You have to evaluate your reaction to the surprise.
Right, you have to know that something happened, right? And then you have to know that it's important. And then you have to decide whether it's good or bad. And only after you've done those 3 things and decided it's bad, do fear and anger even come into play.
Mm-hmm. As a response.
3 bits of information there. So surprise is in some sense the primal one. Usually we process it so fast we're not even aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's
Yes.
something there that, and in fact, learning how to hold that tension of surprise, wonder, of course, being the, and that might actually not be that might be actually a good word to put in here, because mindful response is kind of messy. Mindful wonder is better.
Okay.
You know, but this was I think I think you were the one who taught me that phrase wonder. Doing
It's
right.
mm,
So that is such a powerful word, and I think it's because it taps into, and this explains why. Is you can stay in that place of surprise and wonder. Your amygdala doesn't get triggered. This is the pre-amygdala emotion, I think. Maybe the amygdala is in there too, but like your whole when you're wondering, your whole body is present and fully active. It's the opposite of all
yes.
these other emotions.
Yes. You're
I wonder, instead of mindful, although I like the word, if selfless wonder, or if that's selfless wonder seems kind of redundant. Mindful wonder seems a bit of an oxymoron, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
I I think you're driving towards a purposeful kind of wonder. It isn't daydreaming. It it's the wonder. Wonder brings questions. Wonder does not draw conclusions. It's seeking bigger meaning. It's recognizing there's a complexity of the thing, of the phenomena that's being observed or felt, and opens up the possibility that we may not know what it is that we think we know. So we wonder, what are the possible connections? But it comes like with intentionality or purposefulness, as you wrote, purposeful wonder.
Ooh,
Um,
would wonderful purpose work, or is that going to be too?
um, Except when you turn wonder into wonderful, it tends to bring us. It's not in the. It changes the meaning
Yeah,
to in a way that I don't think you want to go, because then it, oh, how wonderful this is. It brings that sense of
yeah,
joy and happiness, which is not the direction you want to go.
yeah.
This is a pondering. This is a thoughtful encounter with possibilities beyond what we're immediately imagining.
It's actually the opposite, because I realized the line from the Loki TV series, which was also he used in the movie, was "I'm filled with glorious purpose," right before he
Yes.
tries to conquer and
Yeah.
enslave Earth.
Yes.
Right. So it's actually better to have purposeful wonder than a wonderful purpose.
Yes, correct. Yes. Yes. Yes.
All right, I'll go with purposeful wonder. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I think it captures the essence, and we can maybe trim it
Yeah,
later.
could be
But
focused wonder, intentional wonder, but it does have a few syllables in there. So
yeah, focused. What was the other? Intentional.
intentional, intentional.
Intentional. Is
It
intentional
has.
word?
I oh I oh my goodness, I've never used the word intentful. Um, Give me a second
If,
to.
if Google
Yeah.
is willing to intentful. Oh, it does.
Oh look, what is intentful?
It's a thing. Who knew?
It looks like it's a relatively new word. It's not like it has always been there. So full of intent.
There's got to need some hepatosophy.
Yeah, Merriam-Webster didn't like it in particular.
Okay, but it exists.
Yeah.
And
Well, we run.
intentful. I like that better than intentional. One, because it's shorter, but
Yes.
two, it the ability to have intent, to be full of intent and have wonder,
Yeah.
is interesting.
Yeah.
You
Pause
know,
and
it's
think.
different than intentional wonder, which sort of makes wonder the object. That's a fun word. If we can popularize intentful, that'll be an achievement. All right. That was good. Thank you. And then last but not least, joy and self-control. And I realize, of course, the things that bring me joy, like French macarons. We have a lot of French macarons around the house this Christmas. They're the ones that have been destroying my self-control. And I thought I like actually this pairing I really like, because, like I said, we have an addiction to joy in our culture, and the idea that the way to get self-control is not just by having really strong willpower, but by really learning to manage our joy and understand our joy. And this had to be the woman at the well, right? This is the one woman who's been seeking all these husbands, seeking water, living water. And say, oh, by the way, the last one, the Gentile woman, I really wanted to work this one in there, even though it's in some ways it's the most disturbing passage for moderns about Jesus, where the woman comes and says, "Hey, can you heal me?" And Jesus said, "We don't give props to the dogs." It's like, whoa,
yes.
We feel a lot of surprise on that one. But he is surprised and then reverses his thing either ironically or intentionally or what. But
yes,
there's a there. That's probably that and Malchus's ear are the two passages I really want to do with people at some point, because they seem A, so timely, and B, so impossible. Like, I could never preach a sermon on these things that would be any good. But if we can encounter scripture and Jesus in there so that we hear through the Spirit in each other,
yes,
I think it would be transformational.
Yeah, a conversation.
Right. So this idea there, right, of the, and I don't like the word holy here because I don't think it's got the right connotation here. This idea of, but the idea there is like it's joy to me is the essence of connecting, right? Is whether it's connecting with food or people, like, it's weird. So I've been in kind of a drought the last couple of weeks because Robbie's been heads down with his family, and so like for about a couple of weeks, like I've been doing like calls like this every week, or 3 or 4 times a week with people. And Kate was busy, and so like I had this weird thing where like I wasn't connecting. I finally reconnected with Ross a couple of days ago and connected with you. Like there is such joy and meaning, and like when I was going through my rough patches, it was also times where I was not connecting with other people and not connecting with myself.
Good point.
Right. And there's this thing about being properly connected, which is the kind of the idea here, maybe, how about well? Well is a good word.
Oh.
Which is a great pun with the woman at the well. It makes it easier to remember.
Yes. I'm tracking where your thinking goes for that hashtag. Ernie, I've never thought of joy related to self-control. I saw previously how you go from sadness to joy, but I hadn't thought of transforming joy into a concept of self-control. So I'll pause there.
Yeah.
And so I've been listening intently to see how you're carrying this one forward.
Yeah, and for me, the emotion of joy is very close to desire, which is not listed as an emotion, right? But it's desire. It's something that I see as valuable that will bring me joy. And the emotions are connected. My dog here is going to demonstrate some emotions. You want to come up? No? Usually he Zoom bombs me.
Yeah, I've seen him sometimes.
Usually he wants food. This is not food time, so I'm not sure why he's whining. He just wants attention. He wants to connect. We'll just put that there as a sub thing, because that the desire for joy and joy itself get mixed up in my head, and maybe even in the terminology.
Yeah. Are you familiar with C.S. Lewis's perspective on joy?
Yes, he talked about joy as the longing for the thing we don't have.
Yeah.
Right, so that's very much that sense of desire or longing.
Yeah, that would be it. Then a few years ago, I was listening to a podcast by Erwin McManus from Mosaic Church in Hollywood.
Yes, we've started several conversations around Mosaic sermons.
And in this particular one, it was a short concept that became profound for me, because at that time, 8 or 10, might be 10 or 12 years ago now, I was seeking joy. And here's basically what he said. Joy is not something that's external to us. It's something that's already internal. It is our choice to release it. And the whole concept of Christ in me suddenly became more real. Oh, if I'm not feeling joyful, perhaps it's because I'm not releasing that joy that's in me and sharing it with others around me. Or perhaps, and then wrapped up in that was my own psychological construct of, well, aren't I supposed to be happy if I'm joyful? And that isn't true. Joy, for me, I understand it this way. I don't know that others do, but joy is peace and contentment. That doesn't mean I'm happy. It means that I'm at peace and I'm content with the circumstances that are around me. And I can share that with others, even if the circumstances are drastic or dramatic or life-changing or life-taking, as it might be if someone were passing away. And that kind of joy is an unspeakable joy. And I believe Paul references that. I get confused sometimes between what he says in Ephesians and what he says in Philippians. It might be a Philippians part. So that's how I had constructed joy. And I saw what you wrote about sadness to joy. And this one I'm going, Ernie's got something to teach me here, because he's constructed joy with respect to transforming that into self-control. So you now have, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, so that was good, because something else I've been thinking, that actually I've been working on this for a while, and then our church, God's been doing some really interesting things around the fruit of the Spirit, actually, in the same time, spontaneously.
Yeah.
But he said something which, like, I had totally forgotten. Yeah, I'm sure someone told me about this, but I don't have any recollection of this in my head.
Yeah.
A fruit is something for other people to eat.
Okay, sure.
Right, and it's like, oh, yeah. By definition, a fruit is a thing that bears a seed.
Yeah.
The fruit exists to get people to compute, right? And so, like, so this is the thing that this is the difference between human emotion and the fruit of the Spirit, is that you can produce the fruit of joy even if you are in great pain and sorrowful.
Yes. Good
right?
point.
This is not about getting us to feel these things. It's getting us to produce these things for others to experience. And that is, and when they realize that's like, oh my God, this is the gospel. This is evangelism. This is social justice. This is discipleship. Like, this is everything that we want Christianity to be, is the fruit of the Spirit.
Yes.
And the vegetables are structural things, right? So when we call something a vegetable rather than a fruit, technically, it's a part of the plant that's not the fruit. It could be the stalk, it could be the flower, it could be the root. Like, these are important things, right? You know, and but they do not carry the seed of new life.
Not like fruit does,
not
if
like
at all.
Fruit does.
And I don't know enough about the botany involved in differentiating fruit and vegetable. I was just jokingly thinking about it, going, man, if he had said vegetable, I would think like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, and that is not always the most appealing. Now, I can eat those things, but I did not as a child, and you could not have sold me on the gospel if you had spoken about broccoli, asparagus, and Brussels sprouts.
Yeah, and maybe there is a vegetable. I don't know whether there's a vegetable of the Spirit or not. But I think the law is like our vegetables. But let's face it, there's the vegetable. But the law is like the vegetables. It's all the things you need to keep you healthy and keep you alive.
Yeah, no, that's a vital part.
Yeah.
So
we'll go with well-connected for now, because if it's not profound, at least it's a great pun.
So.
And then the last one, which to me is actually the biggest part of what we do here, is public celebration.
Yes.
And just and this is testimony. This is like I said, like, I hear sermons where they say, well, go out and share the gospel. It's like, no. how do we help you have an experience of the gospel that you have something worth talking about, right? And that's, the thing of, like, let's stop yelling at people to eat their vegetables and go out and evangelize. Let's stuff them with fruit. So I guess, like, especially bananas, I guess, which aren't technically a fruit, but anyway, but those tropical vegetables,
Yes.
they get you to, they inspire movement.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
can't help but move. And it's probably just as well that I'm ending on a economical bodily function joke. And it's probably good that this is the last one.
Your mind moves on multiple levels, Ernie, all at the same time.
Are you saying I had my head up my ass?
Ernie, that was a direction I hadn't considered taking it, but since you did, I'll laugh and appreciate the pun of it all.
Thank you so much, Steven. My computer's about to die and my dog wants to go outside, so I will call this a day. But it's been a delight, and you've been so helpful and so encouraging.
Thanks. I've been delighted to learn about Fruit of the Cross. Love that description. Appreciate hearing from you directly on the meaning of the descriptions and how we're transitioning from one to the other. I see your constructs, and they work for me in the way that I think about education, the way I think about my faith, the way I think about sharing, building disciples in Christ, as we have worked on before. So what a wonderful opportunity. What a great way for me to finish out the year with a spiritual focus with you, because that is also how I began the year.
Yeah, and it's a good note to end on. And, of course, actually, the reason I'm doing this is that I got an email from some random online curriculum thing I signed up for. And they said, hey, we're doing a free workshop where you can turn your material into a course in 3 weeks. Okay. And I stared at it and I was like, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't want to do it, but it wouldn't go away. And then I said, I have this thing here that would really work well for that. So I said, okay, I'm just gonna hold it up there. And so January 18th is this class starting.
Yeah. Built in Minerva, I believe is what you said.
Well, I was inspired by Minerva, but this is from a commercial thing called Maven, which does these online master classes. Okay. Minerva doesn't franchise. I can't just take my stuff and do it. I mean, I could try and set up as a school. I mean, my dream, of course, is to get you guys to use this with Minerva for your online school. And at some point, I want to get that introduction to Danny when the time is right. But
I think he's working on that, by the way.
Yeah. So I would love to see, like, when it's right for me to intersect with him. Because I feel like this is the class, like, I want my son to take in Valley. Right? Is do the Minvera-style thing around the Fruit of the Cross and learning, and like, oh my God, if just getting it to happen at all would be amazing. But if I could get that happen for my son, because I can't say these things to him because I have too many vegetables in me.
Yeah, you got it.
I'm not yet.
You're right. It's hard for a dad to speak, to his son. Ernie, does this mean your computer just died, or did you just freeze on the screen? The recording button is still flashing. If I'm the only person being recorded at this time, you need to know that Dr. Ernie is a pretty awesome thinker. Comes through on multiple levels of information and sharing. So have a great day.